In this video, we'll examine some of the most notorious female killers in American criminal history who were sentenced to death for their crimes. We'll explore their backgrounds, what led them to commit murder, their final meals, and the last words they spoke before facing execution. Welcome to Primetime Crime. If you love true crime stories told with real depth and detail, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more. Warning: this video is intended for educational and documentary purposes. It covers real historical events with sensitivity and respect for all individuals involved, including the victims and their families. Viewer discretion is advised. Velma Barfield. Margie Velma Bullard was born on October 29, 1932, in Eastover, North Carolina. She grew up near Fayetteville in a violent and fearful household that shaped much of her life. At 17, eager to escape, she married Thomas Burke in 1949. They had 2 children and, for a while, seemed happy. That changed after a hysterectomy left Velma in chronic pain. Prescribed medications turned into addiction, and the couple's home filled with fights and resentment. On April 4, 1969, after Thomas drank himself unconscious, Velma and the children left for the evening. When they returned, the house was on fire. Thomas was dead inside, and the blaze was ruled accidental. In 1970, Velma married widower Jennings Barfield. Less than a year later, he died suddenly of what doctors called heart complications. Again, no one suspected her. By 1974, tragedy seemed to follow Velma. Her mother, Lillian Bullard, became violently ill with stomach pains but recovered. That Christmas, the same symptoms returned. Lillian died on December 30, 1974, and doctors called it natural causes. The next year, Velma's life unraveled further. Convicted of writing bad checks, she served 3 months in prison. After release, she took work caring for elderly patients, an occupation that should have been about compassion, but instead became her means of murder. Her first employers, Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, both died within weeks in early 1977 after sudden, unexplained illnesses. No one saw a pattern yet. That summer, Velma cared for an elderly woman named Record Lee. When Record's husband, John Henry Lee, fell ill with severe stomach and chest pain and died, suspicion still did not fall on Velma. It took one more death before the truth came out. Velma began dating Roland Stewart Taylor, a relative of Dolly Edwards. To feed her drug habit, she forged checks from his account. Fearing discovery, she mixed arsenic-based rat poison into his beer and tea. Taylor died on February 3, 1978. This time, an autopsy was performed. Arsenic was found in his body. Investigators arrested Velma Barfield. When they exhumed her second husband, Jennings Barfield, traces of arsenic were there too. Velma confessed to several killings, her mother Lillian, Dolly Edwards, and John Henry Lee, but denied poisoning Jennings despite the evidence. Authorities linked her to 7 deaths, though she was tried only for the murder of Roland Taylor. The trial exposed how Velma, a trusted caregiver, had used kindness as a disguise while slowly poisoning vulnerable people. She was convicted and sentenced to death, becoming North Carolina's only woman on death row. Because there was no women's facility for capital cases, she was placed in a unit meant for escape risks and psychiatric inmates at Central Prison in Raleigh. During her years there, Velma changed. She embraced Christianity and began ministering to fellow inmates, offering comfort and prayer. Her transformation drew attention. Even evangelist Billy Graham praised her. Supporters campaigned for her sentence to be commuted, saying she had genuinely reformed. A psychiatrist testified that Velma suffered from dissociative identity disorder caused by years of trauma and that her crimes came from mental illness. But courts rejected the argument. After her final appeal failed, Velma chose to stop fighting. She told her lawyers she wanted to die with dignity. Governor Jim Hunt, facing political pressure during a Senate campaign, denied her plea for clemency. His decision was controversial but decisive. On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection at Central Prison, the first woman executed in the United States since 1962, and the first since capital punishment resumed in 1976. She was also the first woman in America to die by injection. Before her death, she released a final statement. "I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I am sorry, and I want to thank everybody who have been supporting me all these 6 years." Her last meal was modest, cheese doodles and Coca-Cola. She requested her organs be donated. While her heart could not be used, her corneas and skin tissue went to patients in need. Velma was buried in a quiet North Carolina cemetery beside her first husband, Thomas Burke. Her execution left the nation divided. To many, she was a cold-blooded killer who preyed on trust and compassion. To others, she was a broken woman who had found redemption too late. Velma's story remains one of the most haunting in American criminal history, a reminder of how addiction and desperation can destroy lives, and of the complex debate over whether rehabilitation can ever outweigh justice. Aileen Wuornos. It began with a life that seemed destined for tragedy. Born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, Aileen Carol Wuornos came into a world already filled with violence and neglect. Her father was a convicted child molester who ended his own life in prison. Her mother abandoned her and her brother, leaving them with grandparents who were no safer. Her grandfather was cruel and abusive, while her grandmother turned to alcohol to cope. By 11, Aileen was trading sexual favors for food, money, and cigarettes. At 14, she became pregnant, and the baby was given up for adoption. Soon after, her family threw her out, forcing her to live in the woods and survive by hitchhiking. Her teenage years were a blur of rejection, poverty, and pain. Between 14 and 22, she tried to end her life several times, once by shooting herself in the stomach. As an adult, she drifted through arrests, short jail sentences, and addiction. In 1981, she robbed a convenience store in Florida for $35 and a few packs of cigarettes, earning a year in prison. When she got out, the cycle continued with forged checks, stolen cars, and petty crimes. Then, in 1986, she met a woman who would change everything. Her name was Tyria Moore, a motel maid from Daytona Beach. The two women met in a bar and quickly became inseparable. Aileen called Tyria the only person she ever truly loved. To support them, Aileen turned to prostitution on the highways of Central Florida. For the first time, she had someone who cared about her, but years of rage and trauma were already boiling to the surface. In late 1989, the killings began. Aileen started shooting the men who picked her up, claiming it was always in self-defense. Over the next 12 months, 7 middle-aged men were found dead along Florida roads, each shot with the same .22 caliber pistol. Her first known victim, Richard Mallory, was discovered in December 1989. She said he had attacked her, though Mallory himself had a criminal record for sexual violence. After that, bodies kept turning up. Each crime followed the same pattern: robbery, murder, and escape in the victim's car. The murders puzzled investigators at first. Few believed a woman could be responsible, and her victims seemed unconnected. The break came on July 4, 1990, when Aileen and Tyria crashed one of the stolen cars and fled the scene. Witnesses described 2 women, and pawnshop slips later revealed Aileen's fingerprints. Police found her 6 months later at a biker bar called The Last Resort. Tyria was located soon after in Pennsylvania and agreed to help police in exchange for immunity. On recorded calls, she begged Aileen to clear her name. 3 days later, Aileen confessed to all 7 murders, saying each killing was done to protect herself. Tyria walked free, and their relationship ended for good. Aileen's first trial for the murder of Richard Mallory began in January 1992. The prosecution argued she had killed for money, not survival. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with borderline and antisocial personality disorders, describing her as paranoid, impulsive, and emotionally unstable. On January 27th, she was found guilty and sentenced to death 4 days later. She would eventually receive 6 death sentences in total. While waiting for execution, Aileen granted interviews and appeared in documentaries that showed the full range of her mental collapse. One moment, she claimed self-defense. The next, she said she killed out of hatred. Her words swung between rage and confusion. Some saw her as a victim who had finally broken under years of abuse. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer hiding behind excuses. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She refused a last meal, asking only for a cup of coffee. Her final words were strange and almost cinematic. "I am sailing with the Rock, and I will be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6 like the movie. Big mothership and all, I will be back." She was pronounced dead at 9:47 a.m. Her ashes were scattered under a tree in Michigan by her friend Dawn Botkins, while the song Carnival by Natalie Merchant played in the background, just as Aileen had requested. She had listened to that song endlessly on death row. Today, Aileen Wuornos remains one of the most infamous female killers in history. Some believe she was a woman driven mad by abuse and neglect, a product of a system that never protected her. Others see her as a remorseless murderer who used trauma to justify her crimes. Tyria Moore vanished from public life, leaving Aileen's name to echo through documentaries and films that still search for the truth behind her rage. Her story continues to haunt because it blurs the line between victim and monster, and because deep down, it forces us to ask how many broken lives it takes before someone finally breaks completely. Betty Lou Beets. Betty Lou Beets was born on March 12, 1937, in Roxborough, North Carolina, and from the very start, life never gave her a fair chance. Her name was Betty Lou Dinavant, the daughter of James and Margaret Dinavant, and her childhood was steeped in hardship. A severe case of measles left her partially deaf, and she would later say her father was cruel and violent. When her mother was institutionalized, 12-year-old Betty Lou found herself raising her younger siblings, carrying a burden far too heavy for a child. By 15, she was desperate to escape. She married her first husband, Robert Franklin Branson, and began a life marked by one broken relationship after another. Over the years, she would marry 6 times, including twice to the same man, and nearly every one of those marriages ended in chaos, violence, or tragedy. Betty Lou's life was already tangled with trouble before her name made headlines. She had been arrested for public lewdness and once shot a husband, though she was acquitted after he admitted to threatening her life. In 1978, she tried to run over another man with her car. 2 of her ex-husbands would later testify against her, describing her as unpredictable and dangerous. On August 6, 1983, Betty Lou called police in Henderson County, Texas, to report that her husband, Jimmy Don Beets, had gone missing after a fishing trip. Searchers scoured Cedar Creek Lake, finding his boat adrift, heart medicine inside, and no trace of him. For 2 years, everyone believed he had drowned. The truth was buried much closer to home. Her son, Robert Branson, later told investigators that his mother had warned him to leave the house that night. When he returned, Jimmy Don was dead. He helped her dig a shallow grave in the front yard, covering it over before she called police to report him missing. In 1985, a tip finally led authorities to search Betty Lou's property. What they found was shocking. Jimmy Don's remains lay hidden in a filled-in wishing well, a .38 caliber bullet lodged in his body. Then they made another discovery. Beneath the garage floor were the skeletal remains of another man, her former husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, also shot with a .38. She had never even reported him missing. Despite the evidence, prosecutors focused only on Jimmy Don's murder. They charged Betty Lou with killing for profit, accusing her of murdering him for his life insurance and pension. She pleaded not guilty and tried to shift the blame to her own children, claiming they had committed the killings. No evidence supported her story. The trial began in July 1985 and ended quickly. On October 11th, the jury found her guilty. 3 days later, she was sentenced to death. Betty Lou was sent to the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, becoming inmate number 810 on death row. In 1988, her conviction was briefly overturned when a court ruled that insurance money did not legally qualify as financial gain. But that decision was reversed, and her death sentence was reinstated. The next decade was a blur of appeals and delays. Her lawyers argued that she had suffered years of abuse and a head trauma, but the courts were unmoved. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene. By 1999, after 15 years of legal battles, her fate was sealed. On February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was led into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She declined to make a final statement and requested no special meal. At 6:18 p.m., the lethal injection was administered, and moments later she was pronounced dead at the age of 62. She was the second woman executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated. Her ashes were later scattered over her mother's grave, a quiet end to a stormy life. Betty Lou left behind 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. Years later, her daughter Shirley would share her story in the television series Evil Lives Here, describing the lasting scars her mother's actions left behind. For some, Betty Lou Beets was a calculating killer who murdered for money. For others, she was a woman shaped by violence and abuse, repeating the only patterns she had ever known. Her story sits uneasily between both truths, a reminder that some tragedies begin long before the first crime is ever committed. When the dust settled, 2 men were dead, and 2 families were left with questions that could never be answered. Whether Betty Lou was a victim or a villain, the result was the same. Love, money, and violence had mixed into something lethal, and when it was over, she paid for it with her life. Linda Lyon Block. The last time Alabama used its electric chair, it was for a woman named Linda Lyon Block. At midnight on May 10, 2002, the current surged through her body, marking the end of a long and strange story that had begun more than half a century earlier. Linda Cheryl Lyon was born on February 8, 1948, in Orlando, Florida, to Francis and Beryline Lyon. She was 10 when her father died of heart failure, and her relationship with her mother quickly soured. She would later say her mother had been cruel and controlling, a wound she carried into adulthood. As an adult, Linda married Carl Block, an elderly military veteran who had lost his son in a car crash. The marriage didn't last. They divorced in 1991, but she kept his name. By all appearances, Linda seemed to rebuild her life. She threw herself into community work, serving as secretary of the Humane Society in Key West and investigating animal abuse cases. She led the Friends of the Library group, helped a mayoral campaign, and even published her own political magazine called Liberatus. But behind that polished exterior, her life was beginning to unravel. In 1992, Linda and her new partner, George Sibley, broke into her ex-husband Carl's apartment. They tied him to a chair and threatened him over property disputes. During the confrontation, Linda stabbed him once in the chest before fleeing. Carl survived, and both Linda and Sibley were charged with assaulting an elderly person. They pleaded no contest, but never returned for sentencing. Instead, they ran. The couple destroyed their identification papers, renounced their citizenship, and claimed to be sovereign citizens outside the reach of U.S. law. By 1993, they were fugitives, living in their car with Linda's 9-year-old son. On October 4th of that year, they parked outside a Walmart in Opelika, Alabama. A shopper noticed the boy and thought he looked frightened, so she told Sergeant Roger Motley of the Opelika Police Department. Motley approached the vehicle and asked Sibley for his driver's license. According to Sibley, he began arguing that he didn't need one. Then, seeing Motley's hand near his gun, Sibley pulled his own weapon and opened fire. Gunshots rang through the parking lot. Motley returned fire and wounded Sibley, ducking behind his patrol car. Witnesses said Sibley had fired first. Linda was at a payphone nearby when she heard the shots. She ran toward the scene, crouched, and began firing. One bullet struck Sergeant Motley in the chest. He wasn't wearing his vest that day. He had lent it to another officer, and the shot proved fatal. Police quickly surrounded the couple. Both were arrested and charged with capital murder. Although investigators couldn't prove who fired the fatal bullet, they held both accountable. Linda and George refused to cooperate with their lawyers and argued that Alabama had no legal authority over them, claiming the state had never been properly readmitted to the Union after the Civil War. The court rejected their defense. In 1994, both were convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Linda entered death row at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka under inmate number Z575. She spent nearly 8 years there, rarely showing remorse. When her final day came in May 2002, Linda received a few visitors and a spiritual advisor. She declined a last meal and offered no final words. At exactly midnight, she was strapped into the electric chair at Holman Correctional Facility. At 12:01 a.m., the current was applied. 9 minutes later, she was pronounced dead. Linda Lyon Block became the first woman executed in Alabama since 1957, and the last person in the United States to die by electric chair without being offered another method. She was also the final woman executed anywhere in America by electrocution. George Sibley remained on death row for 3 more years. Before his own execution in 2005, he filed a handwritten appeal blaming Linda for the fatal shot. The court dismissed his claim, and he was executed by lethal injection at the same facility where she died. The case of Linda Lyon Block and George Sibley still raises uneasy questions. Both were intelligent and once active in civic life, yet their deep distrust of government and belief in extremist ideology turned them into killers. Their rejection of the law became their downfall. Sergeant Roger Motley left behind a grieving family and a community that still honors him as a fallen officer. Linda's young son, who witnessed the chaos that day, grew up knowing his mother and stepfather had both been executed for a killing he had seen unfold before his eyes. For some, Linda's story is about ideology gone too far. For others, it's about how conviction without compassion can turn deadly. Either way, her death marked the closing chapter of an era, the last spark of the electric chair, and the tragic legacy of a woman who once believed she stood above the law, Ruth Snyder. It began with a photograph. a single flash that captured the exact moment electricity coursed through Ruth Snyder's body, ending her life and beginning her legend. It was January 12, 1928, inside Sing Sing prison, and the image would become one of the most infamous in American history. Ruth Snyder's story started decades earlier, on March 27, 1895, when May Ruth Brown was born in New York. Known simply as Ruth, she grew up energetic and outspoken, a sharp contrast to the quiet, traditional world she was expected to fit into. At 20, she met Albert Snyder, a reserved artist 13 years her senior, who worked as an editor for Motorboating magazine. They married and settled into a modest Queens home, welcoming their daughter Lorraine in 1918. From the outside, they looked like an ordinary family, but inside their house, resentment was brewing. Albert still idolized his late fiancée, Jessie Guichard, keeping her portrait displayed and even naming his boat after her. Ruth could never compete with the ghost of a dead woman. Some say that bitterness festered into hate. Others believe it was Albert's temper and cruelty that drove her to desperation. He was said to be demanding, controlling, and prone to violence when disappointed. By 1925, Ruth had found comfort elsewhere, in the arms of Henry Judd Gray, a married corset salesman she met through mutual friends. Their affair was passionate and reckless. They met in hotel rooms under fake names, exchanging letters and promises of a future together. But Ruth's dreams required removing one obstacle: her husband. She began plotting Albert's death, convincing Gray to help. She also persuaded Albert to sign a large life insurance policy worth $48,000, with a clause doubling the payout if he died violently. That policy would become the motive and the evidence that sealed her fate. According to Gray, Ruth tried several times to kill Albert before finally succeeding. She tampered with his food, planned fake burglaries, even attempted poison, but nothing worked. Then, on March 20th, 1927, they tried one last time. That night, Albert was asleep when Ruth and Gray attacked. They strangled him with picture wire, stuffed his nose with chloroform-soaked rags, and struck him with a heavy sash weight. When it was over, they ransacked the house to make it look like a robbery. Ruth tied herself up and called the police, claiming burglars had killed her husband. But detectives were immediately suspicious. The supposed break-in looked staged, and Ruth's calm demeanor struck them as unnatural. When police found the stolen items hidden inside the house, her story began to crumble. Then came the slip that exposed everything. Investigators found a note with the initials J.G. written on it, belonging to Albert's late fiancée, Jessie Guichard. When they asked Ruth about it, she panicked and blurted out, "Judd Gray has nothing to do with this." It was the first time Gray's name had been mentioned, and detectives instantly knew she was hiding something. Gray was arrested in Syracuse soon after. He tried to deny involvement, but the pressure broke him. Within hours, he confessed, describing in detail how he and Ruth had killed Albert together. Both were charged with first-degree murder. Their trial in late 1927 drew enormous crowds. Newspapers dubbed Ruth the Blonde Murderess, and her photographs filled front pages nationwide. Inside the courtroom, the former lovers turned against each other. Each claimed the other had committed the actual murder. The jury did not buy either story. Both were convicted and sentenced to death. Ruth was sent to Sing Sing prison to await execution, the first woman on death row there in nearly 30 years. Guards described her as polite and quiet, though she often wept when speaking of her daughter. On the night of January 12, 1928, Ruth Snyder walked into the death chamber. Witnesses said she went pale when she saw the electric chair, her knees giving way. 2 matrons helped her sit. 10 minutes later, her lover, Judd Gray, followed her to the same chair. Unbeknownst to the guards, a photographer from the Chicago Tribune had smuggled a miniature camera into the chamber, strapped to his ankle. When the current surged through Ruth's body, he triggered the shutter with a hidden cable. The next morning, the New York Daily News splashed the photograph across its front page under the headline, "Dead." The image shocked America, sparking outrage and debate over whether executions should ever be shown to the public. Ruth was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Gray was laid to rest in New Jersey. Their daughter Lorraine, only 9 at the time, was placed under her grandmother's care. Ruth refused to let her visit the prison before her death, wanting to spare her the memory. The insurance policies that had inspired the murder became the center of legal battles. Courts ruled that the money had been obtained fraudulently, ensuring Ruth's crime would bring no financial reward to her family. Before her execution, Ruth wrote a letter for Lorraine to read when she was old enough to understand. Its contents were never made public. The Snyder-Gray case became a cultural phenomenon. It inspired novels, stage plays, and later the film Double Indemnity, which borrowed heavily from the story of the adulterous lovers who murdered for money. For decades, people argued over Ruth's motives, whether she was an abused woman pushed too far or a manipulative killer who saw murder as her ticket to freedom. The photograph of her execution remains one of the most haunting images in journalism, a frozen moment of life and death that made America confront its fascination with crime, punishment, and spectacle. In the end, Ruth Snyder's crime was ordinary, driven by greed, love, and rage, but her punishment became unforgettable. Her death marked not only the end of a scandal, but the birth of a new era in American media, where even the final moment of a human life could be captured, sold, and remembered forever. Teresa Lewis. The story of Teresa Lewis begins in a quiet Virginia town, but it would end in an execution chamber that made headlines around the world. Her name would become the center of a fierce debate about justice, mercy, and the limits of the death penalty. Teresa Wilson was born on April 26, 1969, in Danville, Virginia. Her parents worked long hours at a textile mill, struggling to support their children. Teresa was a shy girl who loved singing in her church choir and dreamed of a simple, happy life. But by 16, she had dropped out of school and married a man she met at church. They had one daughter, Christy, before the marriage fell apart. Divorce sent Teresa into a spiral of addiction and instability. She turned to alcohol and painkillers to cope. Relatives later described her as not right, a woman with a childlike mind and poor judgment. She bounced between low-paying jobs, living on the edge of poverty while trying to raise her daughter alone. In 2000, Teresa met a supervisor named Julian Lewis at the Dan River textile mill. He was a widower with 3 children. Within months, Teresa and her teenage daughter moved into his home, and she soon became his wife. For a brief time, her life seemed to find direction again. That illusion shattered in December 2001 when Julian's eldest son died in a car crash, leaving behind a $200,000 life insurance payout. Julian used the money to buy a small home on 5 acres in Pittsylvania County. The following year, his younger son Charles, preparing to deploy to Iraq, took out a $250,000 insurance policy naming his father as the main beneficiary and Teresa as the secondary. In August 2002, Teresa met 2 young men at a Walmart in Danville, 21-year-old Matthew Schallenberger and 19-year-old Rodney Fuller. She started affairs with both. Within weeks, they were plotting murder. Teresa promised them money once she collected the insurance after her husband and stepson were dead. On the night of October 30th, 2002, she left the back door unlocked. As she waited inside, Schallenberger and Fuller crept into the house. Julian was shot several times as he slept. Charles was gunned down in his bedroom. Teresa waited almost an hour before calling police, and in that time she took cash from Julian's wallet and handed $300 to each killer. When deputies arrived, Julian was still alive. His final words exposed her. "My wife knows who done this to me," he said. Teresa told police it was a home invasion, but her husband's dying accusation would unravel her story. She was soon caught trying to withdraw $50,000 from Julian's account with a forged check. Within days, she confessed to hiring the men. Investigators learned she had been trying to access the victims' money even before they were buried. At her trial, prosecutors called her the mastermind and said greed was her only motive. The judge described her as the head of this serpent. Her lawyers presented a different picture. Teresa had an IQ of 72, barely above the level for intellectual disability, and experts diagnosed her with dependent personality disorder. Addicted to pills and desperate for affection, she was easily manipulated, they said, especially by Schallenberger, who she believed loved her. But the court was unmoved. Teresa pleaded guilty, hoping her cooperation would spare her life, but it did not. She was sentenced to death, while the two men who carried out the murders received life sentences. Her daughter, Christy, who knew of the plot but said nothing, served 5 years. On death row at the Fluvanna Correctional Center, Teresa turned back to her faith. She sang hymns, prayed with other inmates, and wrote letters asking forgiveness. In 2004, a private investigator interviewed Schallenberger in prison. He admitted Teresa was infatuated with him and not very intelligent, saying she was eager to please. 2 years later, he took his own life behind bars. As Teresa's execution date neared, protests erupted across the country. More than 7,000 people signed clemency petitions, arguing her low IQ should have protected her from execution. Supporters called her a broken woman used by smarter, crueler men. The governor of Virginia reviewed her case but declined to intervene, stating that the courts had already considered her mental capacity. On September 23, 2010, at Greensville Correctional Center, Teresa Lewis was led into the execution chamber. She had spent the evening praying and singing the hymns of her childhood. For her final meal, she requested fried chicken, sweet peas with butter, apple pie, and a Dr. Pepper. Before the drugs were administered, she looked toward her stepdaughter, Kathy, who had come to witness the execution. Her last words were simple. "I just want Kathy to know that I love you, and I am very sorry." At 9:13 p.m., Teresa Lewis was pronounced dead. She was the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly a century, and the last the state would ever execute before abolishing capital punishment in 2021. Her story remains one of tragedy and controversy. To some, she was a manipulative killer who traded lives for money. To others, she was a woman of limited intelligence, desperate for love, led into a plan she barely understood. 2 men were dead, 2 families destroyed, and Teresa Lewis became both a criminal and a cautionary figure. Her case forced America to ask again what justice means and whether mercy should end where the law begins. Francis Newton. Reference video. The night of April 7, 1987, was quiet in Houston until police entered a small apartment and discovered a scene that would haunt them for years. Inside were 3 bodies, a young father and his 2 children, all killed with a .25 caliber pistol. The woman who called them there, Francis Newton, said she was innocent. 18 years later, she would be executed, still insisting the same. Frances Elaine McLemore was born on April 12, 1965, in Texas. By 22, she was married to Adrian Newton, with 2 children, 7-year-old Alton and baby Farah. From the outside, they looked like an ordinary young family. Behind closed doors, things were falling apart. Both Frances and Adrian were seeing other people, and she claimed he had become involved with drugs and dangerous men. Those claims would become her defense, though prosecutors would argue she had planned everything herself. Money was always tight. Frances had already been caught forging checks and stealing from an employer, earning probation for forgery in 1985. Friends said she was charming but impulsive, someone who often made bad choices when pressured. By early 1987, she was desperate. That March, she purchased life insurance policies worth $50,000 each for her husband, her daughter, and herself. She made herself the beneficiary for both Adrian and Farah. Just weeks later, the family was dead. Police found Adrian shot in the living room, the children in their bedrooms. Frances told detectives a drug dealer named Charlie had killed them because of Adrian's debts. No one else ever saw this mysterious Charlie, and investigators quickly began to suspect her. The most damaging evidence came when officers found a paper bag hidden at a relative's house containing the murder weapon. Witnesses said Frances had placed it there. She claimed she only removed the gun from her home for safety, fearing Adrian's supposed drug associates might return. But the pistol traced back to her boyfriend, Jeffrey Freelow, through his cousin, Michael Mouton. Freelow admitted Frances often visited his home, did laundry there, and had access to his drawers where the gun was kept. Prosecutors said it was simple. Frances had forged signatures, bought life insurance, and killed her family for the payout. In 1988, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. She spent nearly 2 decades on death row at the Mountain View unit, all the while claiming she had been framed. Supporters pointed to flaws in the case, missing evidence, and rumors of another gun that was never recovered. They said police rushed to judgment because Frances was poor, black, and already had a record for theft. In 2004, as her execution approached, Texas Governor Rick Perry granted a last-minute 120-day reprieve to allow more testing. A juror from her trial even wrote to say he had doubts about the verdict. But forensic experts later confirmed the bullets from the victims matched the pistol she had hidden. Any hopes of overturning her conviction faded. Her appeals continued for another year. Each one was denied. The courts ruled that every test and hearing had been fair. On September 14, 2005, Frances Newton was led into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit. She declined a final meal and made no last statement. At 6:17 p.m., the drugs were administered. 17 years after the murders, Frances was pronounced dead. She became the 3rd woman executed in Texas since the reinstatement of the death penalty, following Carla Faye Tucker in 1998 and Betty Lou Beets in 1999-2000. She was 40 years old. The victims of the case were easy to forget amid the legal battles, but impossible to ignore in their tragedy. Adrian Newton was only 23, working to support his family. Alton was 7, old enough to understand fear, but not old enough to escape it. Farah was 22 months, still learning to talk. Whether Frances was guilty or not, 3 innocent lives ended that night. Even years later, doubts lingered. Some believed Frances's story about the mysterious drug dealer. Others said the evidence against her was too strong to ignore. Her supporters argued that race, poverty, and an overworked defense team shaped the outcome more than truth did. Critics replied that she had every chance to prove her innocence and never did. Adrian's parents opposed the death penalty but said they believed Frances was guilty. His mother told reporters, "There is no Charlie. She's Charlie." To them, justice had been served. To others, it looked like another example of how the system sometimes demands closure more than certainty. Frances Newton's case became part of the long, complicated history of capital punishment in America. It asked hard questions that never truly go away. How sure must we be before taking a life? What happens when evidence is questioned years later? And what if the person executed was telling the truth all along? Her story has been retold in documentaries and crime shows, but beyond the headlines it remains a story of loss. A family destroyed, a woman condemned, and a state divided over whether the punishment fit the crime. In the end, Frances Newton's death did not end the debate over guilt or innocence. It only deepened the question at the heart of every execution. How much doubt is too much when a human life is on the line? Judy Buenoano, April 4, 1943, marked the birth of Judius Welty in Quanah, Texas, a woman who would later be known as Judy Buenoano and dubbed the Black Widow for her systematic poisoning of family members and boyfriends. Judius, later known as Judy, was born as the third of 4 siblings in a family that would soon be torn apart by tragedy. Her mother died when Judy was just 4 years old. She and her younger brother Robert were sent to live with their grandparents while their lives were in upheaval. Their father eventually remarried a woman who had 2 sons of her own. Judy and Robert moved to join their father and new stepfamily in Roswell, New Mexico. According to reports, Judy was severely mistreated by her father and stepmother. She claimed they starved her and forced her to work essentially as a servant in the household. When Judy was 14 years old, she spent 2 months in detention for attacking her father, stepmother, and 2 stepbrothers with hot grease, a violent outburst that suggested the depth of her anger and desperation. Upon her release, Judy chose to attend reform school rather than return to her family. She graduated from the reform school in 1960. After graduation, Judy became a nursing assistant, a profession that would later give her knowledge about medications and poisons. In 1961, Judy gave birth to a son named Michael. The father's identity was not publicly established, and Judy would reportedly resent Michael throughout his life because he was born outside of marriage. Judy's first marriage was to James Goodyear, a sergeant in the United States Air Force. On September 16, 1971, James Goodyear died in Orlando, Florida. At the time, his death was believed to be from natural causes, and no investigation was launched. Judy collected on James's life insurance policy and moved on with her life. 2 years later, in 1973, Judy moved in with Bobby Joe Morris, a resident of Trinidad, Colorado. Their relationship lasted several years, but in January 1978, Bobby Joe Morris died. Like James Goodyear before him, his death was initially attributed to natural causes. Later that year, in 1978, Judy legally changed her name to Buenoano, a corruption of the Spanish phrase buen año, meaning good year. The name change was meant to echo her first husband's surname of Goodyear, but spelled in a way she thought sounded exotic and sophisticated. Around 1980, Judy's son Michael, whom she had always resented, became severely ill with symptoms including paraplegia, the loss of function in his lower body. Michael was confined to arm and leg braces and required extensive care. On May 13, 1980, Judy took Michael out in a canoe on a body of water in Milton, Florida. According to Judy's account, the canoe rolled over, throwing both of them into the water. Michael, wearing no life jacket and weighed down by his heavy arm and leg braces, drowned before help could arrive. Following Michael's death, Judy collected on his life insurance policy and used the proceeds to open a beauty salon. The drowning was ruled an accident, and once again, Judy faced no consequences. In 1983, Judy was in a relationship with a wallpaper businessman named John Gentry. On a seemingly ordinary day, Gentry was severely injured when his car exploded in Pensacola, Florida. The explosion was dramatic and could easily have killed him, but Gentry survived with serious injuries. While Gentry was recovering in the hospital, police began investigating the car explosion and found several troubling discrepancies in Judy Buenoano's background. Further investigation revealed that in November 1982, months before the car explosion, Judy had begun telling friends that Gentry was suffering from a terminal illness. This pattern seemed suspicious to investigators, especially when they learned about the deaths surrounding Judy's past. Authorities discovered that vitamin pills Judy had been giving to Gentry actually contained arsenic and paraformaldehyde, deadly poisons that would have slowly killed him if he had continued taking them. This discovery prompted authorities to take a dramatic step. They ordered the exhumations of Michael Goodyear, James Goodyear, and Bobby Joe Morris. The results were shocking. All three bodies showed evidence of arsenic poisoning. James Goodyear and Bobby Joe Morris were definitively determined to have died from arsenic poisoning, not natural causes as originally believed. The investigation revealed that Judy had received substantial life insurance payouts after each death, a clear pattern of murder for financial gain. In 1983, Judy Buenoano was arrested on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. In 1984, Judy was convicted of murdering her son Michael and attempting to murder John Gentry. She received a 12-year sentence for the Gentry case and a life sentence for Michael's murder. In 1985, she was convicted of murdering her first husband, James Goodyear, and sentenced to death. She was also convicted of multiple counts of grand theft through insurance fraud. Investigators believed Judy was also responsible for multiple acts of arson, again for purposes of collecting insurance money. Judy Buenoano was acknowledged to be responsible for the 1978 death of Bobby Joe Morris in Colorado, but by the time authorities tied her to his murder, she had already been sentenced to death in Florida. Judy was also believed to have been involved in a 1974 murder in Alabama and in the 1980 death of yet another boyfriend, Gerald Dossett. After her arrest, Dossett's body was exhumed and analyzed for signs of arsenic poisoning, but no charges were filed in that case. The full scope of Judy Buenoano's crimes may never be known, but investigators believed she had systematically poisoned multiple men over more than a decade. Judy was incarcerated on death row at the Florida Department of Corrections Broward Correctional Institution, awaiting her execution. On March 30, 1998, Judy Buenoano was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. For her final meal, Judy requested steamed broccoli, asparagus, strawberries, and tomato wedges with hot tea and lemon, a surprisingly healthy and modest selection. When asked if she had any last words, Judy Buenoano simply said, "No, sir." She offered no apologies, no explanations, and no confessions. She maintained her composure to the very end. Judy's body was cremated following her execution. She became the first woman executed in Florida since 1848, a span of 150 years. She was also the first woman in the United States to be electrocuted since the restoration of capital punishment in 1976. The case of Judy Buenoano, the Black Widow, remains one of the most chilling examples of serial murder for profit in American history. Unlike killers motivated by rage or passion, Judy methodically poisoned the people closest to her, including her own son, in order to collect insurance money. Her victims trusted her completely. James Goodyear married her. Bobby Joe Morris built a life with her. Michael was her own child. John Gentry was planning a future with her. None of them suspected that the woman they loved was slowly poisoning them to death. Judy's case raised disturbing questions about how someone could kill repeatedly over such a long period without being caught, and how many deaths were dismissed as natural causes when they were actually murders. Her execution in 1998 closed the chapter on one of Florida's most notorious serial killers, but the families of her victims were left to grapple with the realization that their loved ones had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible by someone they trusted completely. Judy Buenoano's story serves as a dark reminder that evil can wear a pleasant mask, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who are closest to us. Kelly Gissendaner. Her story was one of contradictions. A woman who arranged her husband's murder yet spent her final years helping others find faith and hope. Kelly Renee Gissendaner's life began in hardship and ended in controversy, leaving behind a haunting question. Can redemption ever outweigh the past? Born on March 8, 1968 in Georgia, Kelly grew up in poverty on her family's cotton farm. Her childhood was scarred by abuse. She told friends and counselors she was molested by her stepfather and other men, leaving deep trauma she would carry into adulthood. In high school, she was sexually assaulted, and 9 months later, she gave birth to her first son. At 19, she married Jeff Banks, but the relationship ended within months. 2 years later, she married Douglas Gissendaner, a hardworking Army veteran who offered the stability she had never known. They had a daughter together, but money problems and infidelity fractured the marriage. While stationed in Germany, Kelly became pregnant by another man, and the couple divorced in 1993. 2 years later, they reconciled and remarried, determined to rebuild their family. They bought a house in Auburn, Georgia, and Douglas became stepfather to Kelly's 2 sons. To neighbors, they looked like a couple getting a second chance. In truth, Kelly was already seeing another man, Gregory Owen, a younger mechanic who would soon become her partner in a deadly plot. In February 1997, Owen ambushed Douglas at Kelly's request. He forced him into his own car and drove to a wooded area. There, Owen beat him with a nightstick and stabbed him repeatedly while Kelly waited nearby. They later burned his car and hid the body. Investigators quickly connected the dots, and both were arrested within weeks. Prosecutors offered each the same deal: life in prison with no parole for 25 years. Owen took it while Kelly refused, convinced she could beat the charges. At trial, Owen testified that she had planned everything, promising him money and love in return for the murder. She was convicted of orchestrating the killing and sentenced to death, becoming the only woman on Georgia's death row. For years, Kelly lived in isolation at Metro State Prison, then Arendale State Prison after 2011. Somewhere during those years, a profound change began. She started studying theology through an Emory University program for inmates and developed a deep Christian faith. She read works by Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Jürgen Moltmann, even exchanging letters with Moltmann about forgiveness and grace. Kelly became a mentor to other women in prison. Guards and inmates alike described her as kind, gentle, and deeply remorseful. She counseled suicidal prisoners through air vents, led prayer circles, and inspired several women to turn their lives around. Many of those women, later released, formed a support group called the Struggle Sisters in her memory. By the time her execution date was set in 2015, Kelly was a completely different person from the manipulative woman who had plotted her husband's death. Her transformation drew global attention. Religious leaders, former judges, and even correctional officers pleaded for mercy. Pope Francis sent a formal appeal through his ambassador, asking that her sentence be commuted to life. Among those supporting her were Norman Fletcher, former Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, and Bob Barr, a conservative Republican who argued that executing Kelly served no purpose since the actual killer was still alive. But in Georgia, the governor had no power to intervene. The decision rested solely with the State Board of Pardons and Paroles. Kelly's execution was postponed twice, once for a snowstorm, and once because the lethal injection drugs were improperly stored. But on September 29, 2015, the board rejected her final clemency appeal. Hours later, Kelly was led to the execution chamber at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. For her last meal, she asked for cheese dip with chips, Texas fajita nachos, and a frosted lemonade. Witnesses said she sang hymns, prayed aloud, and wept. As the drugs were prepared, she began to sing Amazing Grace. Her voice, shaky but sincere, filled the room. Her final words were directed to her children and her husband's family. "Tell the Gissendaner family I am so sorry. That amazing man lost his life because of me. If I could take it back, I would have done it long ago. I just hope they find peace. God bless you." At 12:21 a.m. on September 30th, 2015, Kelly Gissendaner was pronounced dead by lethal injection. She was the first woman executed in Georgia in 70 years, and the only woman executed in the United States that year. Kelly's story divided the nation. To some, she remained a manipulative murderer who deserved her punishment. To others, she had become living proof that even the most broken person could change. Her friendship with theologians, her academic work, and her ministry to other inmates showed a woman transformed by faith. Douglas Gissendaner's family, however, still grieved the man she had taken from them. For them, forgiveness did not erase the loss. Kelly's 3 children had to face the unbearable truth that both parents were gone. One murdered, one executed. In the end, Kelly Gissendaner's case forced Georgia and much of the country to confront the uneasy balance between justice and mercy. Her final song, Amazing Grace, echoed beyond the prison walls, a haunting reminder of a life that had fallen, found faith, and then run out of time. Lisa Montgomery. February 27, 1968, brought the birth of Lisa Marie Montgomery, a woman whose life would be marked by unspeakable abuse, severe mental illness, and ultimately, a crime so horrific it would shock the nation. Lisa's story is one of the darkest in American criminal history, a case that raised profound questions about mental illness, childhood trauma, and the death penalty. Lisa Montgomery had what can only be described as a nightmare childhood that would leave permanent psychological scars. From a young age, Lisa was subjected to repeated sexual abuse by her stepfather. The abuse was not occasional. It was systematic, ongoing, and devastating. At a young age, Lisa started drinking alcohol as a way to escape the horror of her daily reality. When Lisa was 14 years old, her mother discovered her alcohol abuse. Instead of getting her daughter help or protecting her from the abuse she was suffering, her mother threatened Lisa with a gun. But the abuse didn't stop there. From her early teen years, Lisa's own mother forced her to work as a prostitute, an unimaginable betrayal that compounded the trauma she was already experiencing. Lisa tried to tell people about her situation, reaching out for help multiple times. But tragically, no one seemed willing or able to intervene and rescue her from the nightmare. Desperate to escape, Lisa married twice, hoping that marriage would provide an exit from the abuse. Her first marriage occurred when she was just 18 years old, but instead of finding safety, each marriage led to more abuse. Lisa's traumatic past had left her unable to recognize healthy relationships, and she found herself trapped in violent situations again and again. As a result of a lifetime of abuse, Lisa developed a deep mistrust of men in general, a psychological defense mechanism born from years of victimization. Both of Lisa's husbands would later report that she had falsely claimed to be pregnant multiple times during their marriages, a behavior that would become tragically significant later. Lisa had 4 children over the course of her life, but her severe psychological damage made it difficult for her to function as a stable parent. By 2004, Lisa Montgomery's mental state had deteriorated severely. She had developed multiple serious mental health conditions as a result of her trauma. Lisa was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, psychosis, dissociative identity disorder, and amnesia, a constellation of conditions that left her profoundly impaired. Despite her obvious mental illness, Lisa did not receive adequate treatment or intervention. On December 16, 2004, Lisa committed a crime so horrific that it defied comprehension. She had been communicating online with a 23-year-old pregnant woman named Bobby Jo Stinnett, who bred rat terrier dogs as a hobby. Lisa had expressed interest in purchasing a puppy. Lisa drove to Bobby Jo's home in Skidmore, Missouri, under the pretense of looking at puppies. But she had a much darker purpose. Once inside the home, Lisa attacked Bobby Jo. In an act of unimaginable violence, Lisa strangled the pregnant woman and then used a kitchen knife to cut the unborn baby from her womb. Bobby Jo was 8 months pregnant at the time. The brutal attack took her life, leaving behind a husband and a family devastated by the senseless violence. Remarkably, the baby survived the horrific ordeal. The infant was given to her father, who would have to raise her with the knowledge of how she entered the world and at what cost. Lisa fled the scene with the baby, initially claiming the child was her own, but the investigation quickly led authorities to her door. In 2007, Lisa Montgomery confessed to the crime. She was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of Bobby Jo Stinnett. During legal proceedings, Lisa's attorneys presented extensive evidence of her severe mental illness and traumatic history. They argued that Lisa was profoundly mentally handicapped due to her conditions and that she should not have been tried in a regular criminal court. Her lawyers contended that someone with such severe mental illness and such a devastating history of abuse could not be held fully culpable in the same way as someone without those impairments. Mental health experts testified about the catastrophic damage done to Lisa's brain by years of abuse, explaining how her conditions had destroyed her to think rationally or control her actions. But the prosecution argued that regardless of her mental state, Lisa had planned and carried out a premeditated murder, and that she should face the ultimate punishment. The case became a focal point for debates about the death penalty, mental illness, and whether executing someone with severe psychiatric conditions constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Despite appeals based on her mental condition, Lisa Montgomery's death sentence was upheld through multiple levels of appeals. On January 13, 2021, Lisa Marie Montgomery was executed by lethal injection at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. She became the first woman executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years, since Bonnie Heady in 1953. Lisa's execution occurred during the final days of the Trump administration, which had resumed federal executions after a 17-year hiatus. Her case sparked intense debate right up until her final moments, with mental health advocates, religious leaders, and even some prosecutors arguing that executing someone with such severe mental illness was fundamentally unjust. The victim's family remained divided. Some supported the execution, believing justice required it. Others felt that Lisa's execution would not bring back Bobby Jo or heal their pain. Lisa Montgomery's story is perhaps the most tragic in this entire series. A case where there were truly no winners, only victims. Bobby Jo Stinnett lost her life in a horrific act of violence, leaving behind a grieving family and a daughter who would grow up without her mother. Lisa Montgomery, herself a victim of horrific abuse from childhood, never received the help she desperately needed, and ultimately committed an unspeakable crime while in the grip of severe mental illness. Her execution raised questions that remain unanswered. How do we balance justice for victims with recognition of mental illness? Can someone who has been destroyed by abuse be held fully accountable? And what is our responsibility to intervene when we see children being abused before tragedy occurs? Carla Faye Tucker. On November 18, 1959, Carla Faye Tucker was born in Houston, Texas, into a world of instability, addiction, and broken homes. From the start, her life was steeped in chaos. By her teens, she was experimenting with drugs and running with people who lived fast and reckless. The habits and decisions she formed during those years would one day lead her to one of the most notorious crimes in Texas history. By the early 1980s, Carla was addicted to methamphetamine and living a destructive lifestyle with her boyfriend, Danny Garrett. Both were deep in drugs, violence, and anger. On June 13, 1983, the pair decided to break into the apartment of Jerry Dean, a man Carla had been feuding with. They expected the place to be empty. Instead, they found Dean asleep in bed. Fueled by rage and meth, Carla picked up a pickaxe from the apartment and began striking Dean. The attack was frenzied and merciless. Moments later, she found another person hiding under the covers, Deborah Thornton, who had been visiting Dean that night. Carla showed no mercy. She killed her too, leaving behind a gruesome scene that horrified investigators. Carla later told friends about the murders in chilling detail, showing little remorse. The brutality stunned even seasoned officers. By September 1983, both she and Garrett were arrested and charged with murder. Tried separately, both were sentenced to death. Garrett died of liver disease in 1993, but Carla would live long enough to become something unexpected, a national symbol of redemption and debate. Soon after arriving on death row, Carla took a Bible from the prison chapel and began reading. In her words, "I didn't know what I was reading. Before I knew it, I was on my knees asking God to forgive me." She said that moment changed everything. From that point on, she became deeply involved in prison ministry, counseling other inmates and sharing her faith. Her transformation drew attention far beyond Texas. By the mid-1990s, Carla had become a public figure. She married her prison minister, Reverend Dana Lane Brown, in a proxy ceremony in 1995. Her case gained international attention as her execution date neared. Supporters, including pastors, activists, and even some political figures, pleaded for clemency. Pat Robertson, a strong death penalty advocate, broke ranks to call for mercy, saying her conversion was genuine. But not everyone believed a redemption erased the past. The families of Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton still carried their pain. They wanted justice, not sympathy. Texas officials reviewed her case carefully. Then, Governor George W. Bush, though reportedly moved by her story, concluded the law must apply equally to all. On February 3, 1998, Carla was transferred to the Huntsville unit for execution. Her final meal was simple: a banana, a peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing. Witnesses included her sister, her husband, and close friends. When asked for her final words, Carla faced the families of her victims and said, "I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace. Baby, I love you. I will see you when you get there. I will wait for you." Moments later, as the lethal injection began, she whispered prayers and softly hummed a hymn. At 6:45 p.m., Carla Faye Tucker was pronounced dead. She was the first woman executed in Texas in 135 years, and only the second in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated. Her death marked a turning point in the national conversation about capital punishment, redemption, and faith. Supporters saw her as living proof that people could change, even after horrific crimes. They believed her death was a failure of compassion. Critics argued that no spiritual awakening could erase two brutal murders, and that justice demanded accountability. In the years since, Carla's story has remained one of the most discussed in American death penalty history. Her name still sparks debates about forgiveness, redemption, and whether mercy has a place in the justice system. The image of Carla Faye Tucker, once a violent addict, later a calm woman praying before execution, continues to challenge the public to question what punishment really means and whether true change should be enough to save a life.